Due to the graphic nature of these crimes, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of violence, murder, and homophobia that some people may find offensive. We advise extreme caution for children under the age of 13. Jonathan Schmitz trembled as he picked up the phone. The 24-year-old took a moment to compose himself, then raised his hand to dial. He needed to talk to someone who understood what he was feeling, and he needed to let his family know what had happened. However, he couldn't help but be afraid of what they might say. They might laugh in his face, just like he assumed everyone else would be doing soon. He expected the worst. After another moment of hesitation, Jon gritted his teeth and rang his father, Alan. His voice shook as he told his dad that things hadn't worked out so well for him. The TV show he was hoping could turn his life around had done anything but. When Alan heard what his son had experienced, he erupted in fury. As far as he was concerned, Jon had just been insulted in the most personal and humiliating way possible. He screamed into the receiver, cursing every single member of staff on the Jenny Jones show. But his greatest rage was reserved for Jon's friend, the one who'd called the show in the first place. Someone had to pay, and someone would. In the legal definition, a crime of passion is a violent crime that occurs in the throes of extreme emotion, leaving no time to reflect on the consequences. But in this show, we explore how passionate relationships sometimes lead us to criminal activity. How does a husband and wife become killer and victim, or killer and co-conspirator? If there's a thin line between love and hate, what manipulates our relationships into deadly results? This week, we're discussing Jonathan Schmitz and Scott Amedure. The two men were invited on the Jenny Jones show in 1995, where one friend's shocking on-air confession led to murder. Next week, we'll talk about the sensationalized criminal and civil trials that followed. From the beginning, TV cameras captured nearly every moment of the story, turning real-life tragedy into a twisted blame game for public spectacle. We have all that and more coming up. Stay with us. Scott Amedure grew up in a house full of love. The youngest of 4 boys, he was the baby of the family and never shy about standing out. According to his oldest brother, Frank, he enjoyed being the center of attention and making others smile. He seemed destined for the spotlight. When he grew up, Scott joined the U.S. Army, and at some point during his service, he told his family he was gay. While people were much less accepting during this time, Scott's brother Frank stated the confession didn't cause any friction. Scott's parents and siblings happily accepted him for who he was. Scott was able to be open about himself, and as a result, his self-confidence was infectious. He always knew how to light up a room. That kind of charisma made Scott the life of the party. Sometimes it only took him a single conversation to make a new connection. By 1995, the 32-year-old lived in Lake Orion, Michigan, and had polished his charm to a brilliant shine. Though his social circle was already large, Scott was always adding to it. One day, when he stopped by his brother's apartment complex for a visit, he spotted a friend, Donna Riley, working on her car outside. Helping her was a handsome man Scott had never seen before. That man was Jonathan Schmitz, a 24-year-old server at a local bar. He also lived in the complex and had become close with Donna. Scott was instantly drawn to Jon. He had close-cropped dark hair and dreamy eyes to match. So, Scott made his move. He lightly teased Jon about the peace sign he'd drawn on his own vehicle. He said he was surprised because Jon looked like anything but a hippie. Jon took it in stride, engaging with Scott. Scott was a bit of a handyman himself, So they quickly struck up a conversation about the car repair. By the end, Scott was enamored. Over time, the two became friends and grew to know each other well. But Jon was a very different person than Scott. He hadn't been raised to be open about who he was. Instead, his childhood was marked by strict discipline and intense punishment. His father, Alan, was reportedly abusive, and even he testified that he had no qualms about hitting his children when they stepped out of line. Once, when Alan found out a young Jon had skipped class, he forcibly dragged his son back to the school. There, in front of Jon's classmates, Alan took off his belt, grabbed Jon by the hair, and spanked him viciously. Jon carried the traumatic incident with him for decades. His father used public humiliation as a weapon, and his overbearing concern for the family's reputation put Jon constantly on guard. Alan was also deeply homophobic, and as Jon hit high school, Alan seemed particularly concerned with his son's sexual preferences. He made it clear that he would have considered it an embarrassment if Jon had been gay. Jon, as well as his close friends and family, always maintained that he has never been romantically involved with another man. That said, a couple of Scott Amedure's friends claimed Scott had a romantic fling with Jon, but Donna Riley, who knew them both well, adamantly denied those rumors. However, Jon's preferences and individual experiences are less important than how he felt he was perceived. Though he publicly dated several women and was even engaged to a woman for several years, his family still questioned his sexuality. In the US, there is a public stigma attached to being gay, and it was even more prevalent in the 1980s and 90s. But Jon felt the stigma even more strongly because of his father. He knew there would be social consequences if his family had any reason to question his sexuality. Before I continue with Jon's psychology, please note, I am not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist, but we have done a lot of research for the show. Learning homophobia from a father figure can have disastrous long-term psychological effects. According to one 1985 study, this kind of homophobia can even limit a man's ability to form close friendships with other men. Another investigation, conducted 12 years later at the Forensic Mental Health Division in San Diego, came up with similar results. The authors of that study wrote, "There was some indication that homophobia does relate to less intimate disclosure to other males. Thus, this study found some support for the idea that homophobia is an obstacle to intimacy for men. A difficulty opening up to other men would have made it unlikely for Jon to fully trust any man, much less one he knew to be gay. So the simple fact that he was becoming friends with Scott Amedure may have caused some internal conflict for Jon. But if it did, Scott wasn't discouraged. No one described Jon as being openly homophobic, and Scott didn't feel Jon was intolerant. In fact, the closer the two became, the more Scott fell for Jon. He wasn't sure whether Jon shared his feelings, but he didn't see the harm in taking a chance. As the months wore on, he steadily nurtured his crush, trying to find something that would get Jon to see him as a romantic option. One day in early 1995, 32-year-old Scott thought of a way to live his dreams. He'd always relished the limelight and wanted to make a grand gesture to impress Jon and win his heart. He could kill two birds with one stone by confessing his crush to the world on television. And in 1995, the easiest way for a regular person to get their moment in the sun was to go on a daytime talk show. At the time, there were more than a few to choose from. Some had started as more serious, conventional shows, but quickly became exploitative and outrageous to compete in a saturated market. The most famous of these is probably The Jerry Springer Show, but it wasn't always known for taboo topics, scantily clad dance competitions, and intense onstage physical fights. In its first few years, Springer's show actually featured grave political interviews and investigative exposés. But because it aired in the middle of the day, it struggled to find an audience. People were used to tuning into the nightly news or Sunday morning punditry for that kind of serious content. They wanted to watch something more fun and turn their brains off for a bit during the weekdays. Fearing cancellation, Springer's format steadily shifted to highlight personal, controversial, and scandalous stories mined from its audience. The change was massively successful, eventually making the program legendary for its ridiculous, over-the-top stories, broadcasting salacious private gossip to every corner of the United States. The Jenny Jones Show, which started airing in late 1991, had a similar trajectory. Originally, Jones sought to replicate Oprah's success by featuring serious interviews and heartfelt stories. After a few years, however, her show faced the same dilemma Springer's had. Her ratings were plummeting. No one wanted to tune in to hear Jones discuss epidemics or interview sympathetic subjects. So she and her producers gave the people what they thought they wanted. By 1995, Jenny Jones's show was often compared to Jerry Springer's. She featured paternity test scandals, viewer talent competitions, and, of course, plenty of romantic drama. That last element appealed most to Scott Amedure. He loved daytime talk shows and often discussed the latest wild antics with his friends. So, in early 1995, when The Jenny Jones Show asked viewers to call in and confess their secret crushes, he thought it was his shot to have some fun and get on TV. Scott recruited Donna Riley to help him out. Donna wasn't sure whether Jon returned Scott's feelings, but she apparently thought there was a chance he did. And like Scott, she saw the opportunity as a fun, once-in-a-lifetime thrill ride. She happily agreed to serve as another guest on Jenny Jones. She would be playing the neutral friend role, the matchmaker in the background. Their plans would have shocked Jonathan Schmitz. When the Jenny Jones producers cold called him in late February 1995, he didn't know what to think. One former producer testified that she told him he had a secret admirer, and that the person might be a woman or a man. Few people could resist such a tantalizing mystery. Jon was intrigued, but also cautious, because his most likely admirers might not have been much of a secret. Almost immediately, he suspected either Scott or Donna, perhaps because he knew they both enjoyed daytime TV. But Jon didn't have romantic feelings for either. On the initial call, Jon played it coy. He told the producer he couldn't give them an answer right away. He also said up front that if it was a man, he wouldn't want to do the show. In the margins of the production notes for the episode, someone jotted that down. The Jenny Jones Show never figured out who made that note, but reportedly, Jon was so adamant that a producer eventually assured him, or at least implied, his admirer was a woman. Not satisfied even with that, Jon went to see Donna and Scott to try and weasel some information out of them. He cautiously asked if either had any big plans coming up right around the time of the taping. But they were prepared. The secret was the whole point of the show. They couldn't come clean right away. They both lied and made up some other plans to cover their tracks, and whatever they said apparently satisfied Jon. With those two options eliminated, Jon let himself daydream. A few months earlier, he'd ended a years-long engagement with a woman. He told his restaurant co-workers he hoped his former fiancée had called the show to give him another chance. His second choice was actually another coworker, a woman he felt a spark with. All the talk about Jon's hopes likely deflated Scott's own dreams a bit, but Scott was still excited. He held on to his belief that a public romantic confession might woo Jon and lead him to reconsider his feelings. Worst case scenario, he'd still get to be on TV. To Scott and Donna, the taping was an event, a fun story they could tell for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the more Jon thought about the opportunity, the more excited he became. He hadn't been feeling great since ending things with his fiancée, but the cold call might have been a sign from the heavens. He wanted to believe he was on the verge of turning things around. He said that if his ex-fiancée was the one who'd called Jenny Jones, he would definitely marry her this time. No more hesitation. Now was the time for courage. He decided to take the plunge. Jon called the producer back and accepted the offer. He'd be getting a free flight from Michigan to Chicago, but he didn't see it as a vacation. He spent several $100s on some new clothes to look his best and hopped on a plane. The next phase of his life was about to begin. Coming up, a dream come true turns into a nightmare. In March 1995, 24-year-old Jonathan Schmitz flew from his home in Michigan to Chicago to be on the Jenny Jones show. Unbeknownst to him, his secret admirer, 32-year-old Scott Amedure, was also on his way to the set, along with their mutual friend, Donna Riley. Before the taping, Scott was nervous. He was looking to have a good time, but had genuine feelings for Jon and didn't want to put him in an awkward position. Jenny Jones and her producers, on the other hand, were more concerned with putting on a good show, which meant the confession had better be salacious. According to Scott's mother, Jones pressured Scott to give Jon flowers on stage or try to kiss him in front of the cameras. Scott refused on both counts. Meanwhile, Donna claimed a producer had encouraged them to have a few drinks to loosen up. They seemed to be doing anything they could to stir up conflict during the filming. Though the producer denied encouraging the drinking, the show did pay for Scott and Donna to open a tab at the hotel bar. When the day of the show, March 6th, came around, Jon was taken backstage and given soundproof earphones. Meanwhile, Scott and Donna gave a short interview in front of a packed audience. Jenny Jones stood surrounded by the crowd. Her bright yellow blazer and straw blonde hair stood out against the faux wood paneled set. With a huge smile plastered across her face, she gave the impression of the fun aunt at the family reunion. All around her were smiling faces in stadium seating, hungry for drama. Donna and Scott were crammed close together in small chairs on stage. From the beginning, the angle was obvious. Jones hyped up the fact that Scott was gay, but Jon's sexuality was still in question. When asked, Donna told Jones she wasn't sure if Jon would be interested, but she knew his family had questioned his sexuality before. Jones went further, pushing Scott to describe the sexual fantasies he'd had about Jon. Scott was clearly nervous, but gave a brief answer involving his backyard hammock and some whipped cream. The audience hooted and jeered. After getting Scott to describe Jon as a cute, tiny thing, Jones finally called Jon on stage. The moment Jon stepped out from behind the curtain, his confusion was obvious. In front of him were the two people who'd assured him they weren't his secret admirer. Still, he smiled for the crowd, came down and kissed Donna on the cheek. He then reached out to shake Scott's hand. Scott tried to pull Jon into a hug, which Jon resisted, resulting in an awkward one-armed embrace. It looked extremely uncomfortable. Afterward, Jon sat down next to Scott, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The first thing Jenny Jones asked Jon was whether he thought Donna was his secret admirer. Jon hesitated, then admitted he did not. He only considered Donna a friend. He'd hardly finished his sentence when Jones interrupted to drop what she clearly thought was the bombshell. Scott was the one with the crush. The glee in her voice was palpable. Clearly, this was intended to be the twist of the episode, intended to catch Jon off guard and win them a candid reaction. And the reason it was framed as a surprise worthy of daytime TV was because Scott was gay. When Jones revealed Scott was the secret admirer, the audience clapped, laughed, and shouted. And though Jon kept smiling, he didn't seem very happy. He turned to Scott and Donna and said they'd lied to him. His voice wasn't too serious. He had the tone of someone admonishing a naughty child. As the audience laughed again, he clapped a few times and sat back. He didn't exactly look comfortable, but his attitude was that of someone whose friends had just pulled a prank. He was trying to play along, even though he probably didn't want to. However, the show had just begun. Before Jones asked more questions, she played back some footage from the interview with Scott a few minutes earlier. Jon sat in the hot seat and watched the video of Scott describing his hammock fantasy. At that, Jon covered his face with his hands and composed himself, his plastered smile still intact. The reaction might not have been enough for Jones because she continued to play up the fantasy aspect even after Jon watched the footage. She told him Scott had a lot of fantasies about him and that he'd been having them since the two first met. The framing was more than a little exaggerated. Just a few minutes earlier, anyone could plainly see Scott was reluctant to discuss the topic, but Jones made it sound like it was his favorite thing to talk about. She then asked if Jon knew Scott had a crush on him and whether he felt the same way. Jon said he had no idea, but didn't have any romantic feelings for Scott. It wasn't a rude response, though Jon clearly felt the need to stress that he was, quote, heterosexual. It wasn't enough just to tell Scott he wasn't interested. He was clearly conscious of the fact that he was on television and couldn't bear the thought of any audience members or viewers watching at home questioning his sexuality. This might have been the first real sign that Jon's sense of self was bruised. When a person believes that someone is making a direct attack on their pride, they may experience a phenomenon known as threatened egoism. People with high self-esteem are at particular risk. When a man or woman with a large ego feels themselves being undermined, they might lash out. Some even turn to violence. But at that point, Jon kept his feelings under wraps. When he proclaimed that he was, quote, definitely heterosexual, the response from the Jenny Jones crowd was overwhelming. A massive round of applause, louder than any of their other reactions. It didn't seem to only be a show of support for someone in an awkward position. It sounded a lot more like approving applause. They were in favor of him being straight, and implicitly, that meant they weren't so much in favor of him being gay. Their claps seemed to make Jon a little more comfortable and perhaps soothed his aching ego. When Jones prodded him for more stories about Scott, he retold the story of their first meeting from his point of view. Jenny Jones didn't seem too engaged by his rendition. She started to ask again if Jon was sure he wasn't interested in Scott, then shifted her focus, asking Scott if he was disappointed by Jon's rejection. Scott claimed he wasn't really let down. He was never confident Jon liked him back. He just thought the whole thing was worth a shot. The interview ended after that, with video of the trio on stage smiling and clapping before cutting to a commercial. The very last image shown featured a golden background with some text splashed on top. It read, 3% of men report having sexual fantasies about their best friend of the same sex. That final card confirmed the angle of the episode. The show was focused on that specific 3% of men, and those in charge weren't concerned with those men pursuing relationships or falling in love. They only cared about their lurid sexual fantasies, especially if the people in question were infatuated with the best friend. But Scott, Donna, and Jon's stint on the Jenny Jones show ended with a whimper. All in all, Jon didn't seem happy about his time in the spotlight, but he also didn't seem too upset. By all appearances, he treated the whole thing like a joke. He mingled with Scott and Donna after the show, then drove them home from the airport back in Michigan. The trio even stopped on the way to have a few drinks together at a place called Brewski's. Even then, Jon didn't give any outward indication he was angry. What happened next is murky. Most accounts agree that Scott, Donna, and Jon went home separately after having a few drinks. But years later, a different story emerged. One of the producers on the Jenny Jones show, a man named Ron, claimed that Scott called him the day after the taping to report some tantalizing gossip. According to Ron, Scott said he and Jon had shared a private romantic moment after having a few drinks back home in Michigan. He told Ron the two of them had slow danced together and then shared a kiss. A second producer backed Ron up, testifying that while she hadn't overheard Scott herself, Ron told her about the call right after he and Scott hung up. This version of the story, however, is dubious. The producers never shared that information, which was clearly relevant, with anyone until 4 years later. And when they did share it, they had reason to believe that dropping such a bomb could protect them from legal liability. Since then, no one else has ever corroborated this version of the account. It's more likely that the trio all went their separate ways after their drinks at Brewski's. Because while Jon didn't display any outward anger towards Scott, he was secretly fuming. He felt humiliated. He claimed the producers had assured him his secret admirer was a woman, and that was the only reason he'd agreed to the show in the first place. He'd even convinced himself that his ex-fiancée might have been trying to patch things up. The bottom line, Jon had been tricked. Even if he knew Scott was sincere, he couldn't see past his own embarrassment. In his mind, he was the victim, and it didn't feel good. For a few hours after arriving back in Michigan, Jon stayed up late drinking with friends from work. At some point, he called his father Alan to explain what had happened. Alan was livid, fueling the fire burning in his son's belly. He didn't just curse the show, he was angry at Scott Amedure too. And the fact that Scott was gay was to him the major sticking point. Alan called Scott a homophobic slur and was apparently so upset by the call that he physically threw a chair. He didn't just escalate the situation. He made Jon's appearance on Jenny Jones seem like an embarrassment of apocalyptic proportions. He literally told his son that he should go out and kill Scott Amedure to prove he wasn't gay. By the time the call was over, Jon was fuming. He needed to take drastic action. He would make Scott Amedure pay. Coming up, Jon gives in to hate. Now, back to the story. On March 6, 1995, Scott Amador confessed he had a crush on his friend, 24-year-old Jonathan Schmitz, on the Jenny Jones daytime talk show. Jon felt homophobic embarrassment after the taping, worried viewers or his family might think he was gay. Jon's father, Alan, only made things worse. He primed Scott to explode over the phone because of his own fragile ego. The real issue, which Alan later acknowledged, was that he was humiliated by the news. Perhaps even more than Jon, he couldn't stand the thought that someone might believe his son was gay. The next 2 days passed without incident. It doesn't seem like Jon spoke to Scott and Donna. He might have been trying to keep his distance and decompress. On the night of March 8th, he stayed the night at a female friend's house. The following morning, around 10 a.m., he returned to his apartment. Scott had left a flashing construction light he'd swiped from the airport on Jon's porch. Right next to it, impossible to miss, sat a handwritten note. It was unsigned, but read in part, "You have the tool to turn this off. P.S. It takes a special tool." It's unclear why Scott wanted to give Jon a flashing light, but combined with the note, it was very likely his way of saying everything would blow over and asking for forgiveness. Even Donna claimed it was just a joke, and given Scott's lighthearted attitude toward the affair, that seems likely. But Jon didn't think it was funny. The note was the final straw. The homophobia Jon learned from his father made him feel humiliated. To him, being called gay was a direct insult to his manhood. So, he took drastic and disgusting measures to reclaim it. This connection between masculinity, heterosexuality, and violence is important. In a study entitled Boys and Violence, a Gender-Informed Analysis, researchers Fader, Levant, and Dean wrote, "Masculine ideals such as the restriction of emotional expression and the pressure to conform to expectations of dominance and aggression may heighten the potential for boys to engage in general acts of violence." Jon falsely equated being gay with being less of a man. So now, if he didn't respond like a man with overwhelming violence, then he thought he'd never be able to live his imagined humiliation down. There was only one thing he could do to prove once and for all who he was. Perhaps he believed in that moment that his appearance on the show would follow him for the rest of his life. Ironically, his next actions made sure it did. After reading Scott's note, Jon drove directly to the bank and took $300 out of his account. Then he headed to Tom's hardware store. He needed a special tool. Jon passed by rows of hammers, drills, and saws. He eventually found a clerk and bought a pack of 12-gauge shotgun shells from her. Next, he headed to Gary's gun shop, not too far from his apartment. There, he bought a gun to go with his ammunition. He told the shop owner he was going hunting with his father, then casually mentioned he was late for work and headed out. But Jon didn't plan on clocking in. Instead, he went back to his apartment and assembled his new shotgun in the parking lot. When he was done, he finally sat back and thought about his situation. The reality was that Scott hadn't done anything wrong. He had only intended to confess his feelings for Jon to see if he felt the same way. While Jon might have perceived the Jenny Jones surprise as unfair pressure, it was actually a romantic gesture Scott had worked hard to arrange. Jon knew Scott was his friend, and had he been reasonable, it would have been easy for him to see the note was a joke. After all, it certainly wasn't a threat. And yet, Jon was sitting there in his car with a Mossberg shotgun across his lap and dark thoughts in his brain. It's impossible to know everything that went through his mind in those moments. Perhaps a small part of him cried out that he was about to do something unforgivable. But if it did, It was drowned out by the words of his father. Jon apparently decided there was nothing worse than humiliation. But Jon's point of view was as selfish as it was petty and homophobic. He hadn't been the only one in the hot seat that day. Scott was also needled by Jenny Jones. He was pressured by producers into revealing his sexual fantasies on television. And while Jon got a round of applause for telling the crowd he wasn't gay, Scott was portrayed as the loser. If anyone had a real reason to be upset, it was Scott. He'd not only been flat out rejected by his crush, he had put himself out there to be judged by potentially millions of people. And as a gay man, he likely knew that judgment would be unkind. Yet Scott handled the situation with grace. Jon might have believed he was being nice by going out with Scott and Donna for drinks after the show, but it's easy to see how Scott might have felt the same way. Perhaps he left the joke note for the same reason he stopped for a couple of drinks. He may have wanted to show Jon that the two of them could still be buddies and joke around together, even after his confession. Scott was a true friend. He couldn't have missed Jon's discomfort after the show and likely knew it was rooted in homophobia. But he didn't reject Jon or cut off all contact after it was clear things wouldn't work out romantically between them. He stuck around, perhaps because he thought he saw some good in Jon too. It's just a shame he was wrong. After a few minutes of quiet thought, seemingly only about himself, Jon strapped in and put the car in drive. Around 11 a.m., he arrived at Scott's gleaming white mobile home and parked in the driveway. He left his gun in the car and approached the thin white door. Bright pink crepe paper peeked out through its small window, a simple setup for privacy, and a lightning rod for Jon's anger. Jon knocked hard. Scott answered quickly. He was in the living room and his roommate, Gary Brady, stood beside him. Gary listened as Jon asked Scott whether he'd left the provocative note outside his apartment. Scott told him he had. That seemed to be the answer Jon was looking for. He told Scott to give him a moment. He'd left his car on and needed to shut it off. Scott shrugged as Jon walked back down the driveway. This time, he came back with the shotgun. When Scott saw Jon carrying a weapon, he quickly tried to shut the door. He yelled for Gary to help, but Jon pushed into the trailer using the gun. Completely cornered, Scott picked up a nearby wicker chair to defend himself. It was no use. Jon fired twice, hitting him square in the chest. Scott Amador was dead. Frank Amador braced himself as he exited the courtroom. Within moments, reporters swarmed him, shoving microphones in his face and shouting questions. Frank cocked his head to the side to avoid looking down the barrel of the cameras and tried to smile politely. He wasn't one to crack under pressure, and right now, for his brother's sake, he had to keep his composure. Just like in the courtroom, giving into his emotions would only make the situation worse. Frank kept his expression even as he answered question after question after question. Yes, of course, he was still committed to getting justice for Scott. No, he wasn't angry when he listened to his brother's killer testify. But on behalf of his family, he had to be honest. The defense's case was a bunch of bull. He kept his statements short and sweet, though it didn't seem to matter either way. There was no end to the curiosity. Every day he had to relive his brother's violent death in court, then relive it again for the media until he could finally go home and grieve. Still, he pushed through it all because he hoped in the end Scott would be at peace. Frank wasn't naive enough to be confident, but he did have faith. If he played his small role, maybe the jury would deliver the verdict he believed was just. Maybe eventually he would get the result he wanted so desperately. That small thing might make things feel all right again, at least for a moment. But he didn't get what he wanted. No one did. Last week, we covered the tragic tale of Scott Amedure and Jonathan Schmitz. In 1995, Scott confessed his secret crush on Jon during a taping of the Jenny Jones show. Jon was terrified audiences would think he was gay and left the episode furious. 3 days later, in an act of homophobic revenge, he killed his former friend. This week, we'll talk about the sensationalized criminal and civil trials that followed Scott's murder. Ravenous, the media kept the case on air every step of the way as it evolved from daytime TV talk shows to the nightly news. We have all that and more coming up. Stay with us. On the morning of March 9, 1995, 24-year-old Jonathan Schmitz found a tongue-in-cheek note outside his apartment door. It came from his friend, Scott Amedure. 3 days earlier, Jon was embarrassed when Scott told the audience of the Jenny Jones show that he had romantic feelings for Jon. Jon returned home to Michigan, worried that TV viewers would assume he was gay. Ever since the taping, he'd stewed over what he felt was a humiliating insult. And now, for whatever reason, the provocative note became his breaking point. Jon was infuriated that Scott saw the whole thing as a joke. Or maybe he was simply waiting for any excuse to get violent. Either way, Jon took his revenge. After stumbling upon the note, Jon bought a gun, headed over to Scott's mobile home outside of Lake Orion, Michigan, and shot him twice in the chest. By the time the smoke cleared, Jon had already hopped in his car and sped out of the neighborhood in a panic. It's not clear if he really had a plan. Scott's roommate Gary Brady saw the shooting firsthand, but Jon didn't try to harm him. There was no point in trying to get rid of witnesses. He'd done everything in broad daylight. Earlier that morning, Jon withdrew $300 from an ATM, which he might have intended to use to escape. But once he was on the road, he must have realized $300 wouldn't be enough to get away with murder. After a few minutes of hectic driving, he pulled into a gas station parking lot to gather his spiraling nerves. It didn't take long for Jon to come to grips with his situation. He was never going to get away clean. Running would only make things worse. After some thought, he decided his only chance was to turn himself in. If he cooperated, maybe he could work something out. Hands trembling from fear and adrenaline, Jon walked to a nearby payphone and dialed 911. His voice started out even, but quickly started to shake. Jon told the dispatcher he'd shot Scott Amedure because Scott had played a, quote, mean joke on him. He claimed it was all because Scott took him on Jenny Jones. After Jon's confession, police took him into custody, and from there, the news traveled fast. Scott's brother, Frank Amador, was one of the first to hear about the murder. Because he lived in the same town as Scott, he arrived at the crime scene soon after the police. But already, word had gotten around. A neighbor told reporters she heard the shooting was about Scott's appearance on Jenny Jones. Officers advised Frank to get a good lawyer, warning him the story would become a media circus. They were absolutely right. From the beginning, TV cameras covered almost every second of the story. Not only was Jon's motive unusual, but the media itself was directly involved in the crime. Suddenly, journalists and talk shows got to be major characters in a murder, not just the spectators, and they took full advantage of their new roles. But all the media coverage may have had a drastic impact on the jury well before the trial. Before I continue with their psychology, please note, I am not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist, but we have done a lot of research for the show. A psychological study conducted in 1994, just a year before the shooting, determined that pretrial media coverage can unconsciously shape the opinions of jurors. In their paper, Researchers James Ogloff and Neil Vidmar laid out some damning facts about mass media. Serious crimes, or those with a shocking or salacious angle, receive the most airtime, and in general, journalists prioritize grisly details and incriminating information about suspects. This can benefit the prosecution, since the discovery of contradictory evidence isn't usually covered as widely. However, the study also determined that those most affected by pretrial coverage were often completely unaware of their bias. Study participants who were exposed to this kind of media consistently recommended more severe punishments than those who weren't. Overall, the research found people tend to be overconfident that they haven't been influenced by outside factors. In general, more coverage of a crime often makes it more likely that defendants are found guilty, but it can go either way. No matter which way the media influenced the jurors' opinions in Jon and Scott's case, it probably had some effect. And it's also likely that none of the jurors or reporters even realized they were being swayed. That point is especially important in this case, because the cameras weren't just outside the courthouse, and reporters weren't just hounding the Amadors and Schmitzes on the street. Court TV, a channel dedicated in part to gavel-to-gavel coverage of salacious trials, had cameras rolling live inside the courtroom. It wasn't as sensational as the typical daytime talk shows, but it still employed reporters and TV hosts who were constantly hovering, hoping to land a surprise interview. The pressure was on for everyone involved. Frank Amador later admitted that he worried whether the family had fallen into the media's, quote, trap. He, along with members of the Schmitz family, thought they needed to go along with the spectacle. It felt like talking to journalists was a necessary step in finding justice, and it was only natural to want to publicly defend themselves, especially during such a contentious trial. Though whether the media coverage was helping or harming the case was debatable. All the talk may have only added fuel to the fire. Depending on its angle, each show played up certain aspects of the lurid crime. Some may have even exaggerated to create big stories out of every little twist and turn. In a sense, the families involved got an extended taste of what every guest on the Jenny Jones show endured. Their dirty laundry was broadcast to the world to satisfy the public's morbid fascination. Over the following weeks and months, rumors and accusations spread like wildfire. Donna Riley, who was on the Jenny Jones show with Scott and Jon, was swept up in the drama as well. Though she didn't speak to the media much herself, it was clear she was shocked and confused by the murder. She was close friends with both men and had no idea Jon was capable of that kind of violence. She thought the Jenny Jones taping would be a fun, once-in-a-lifetime experience. Instead, it was a horror story that never seemed to end. Meanwhile, new programs hosted in-depth discussions about Jon and Scott's sexuality, helmed by people who had never met either of them. Many publicly speculated that Jon was closeted. His parents were scrutinized and ridiculed. Scott's family also had to endure invasive interrogations about his private life. Depending on the day, shows painted both men as drug addicts or sexual deviants. Neither was true. It was exactly the kind of speculation Jon Schmitz claimed he feared when he killed Scott Amedure. And ironically, he made his own nightmare come true. Thanks to Jon's own ego and intolerance, his minor talk show appearance became the defining event of his life. He'd be haunted by his actions forever. With all the evidence against him, there was no real debate about Jon's culpability going into the proceedings on October 14, 1996. But his defense team did hope to score a less serious conviction, such as second-degree murder. That would mean Jon was guilty of intentionally killing Scott, but had not planned his crime beforehand. To that end, they deployed a legal strategy known as the gay panic defense. The exact logic, or lack thereof, in these arguments has varied over the years. Sometimes defendants claim they were provoked to violence by unwanted sexual advances from a member of the same gender. Sometimes they say these advances were physically threatening and they only acted in self-defense. Still, others say they completely saw red or blacked out and had no memory of committing the crime at all. Essentially, Jon's attorneys argued he was put in a state of temporary insanity as a result of being humiliated by Scott's on-air confession. The murder, according to them, wasn't really premeditated. Jon wasn't thinking clearly at the time. The explanation wasn't intended to entirely excuse the crime, but instead lessen Jon's punishment. Over the years, this strategy has been used in many criminal cases, but it is problematic and many scholars argue it should not be allowed in a court of law. Legal professor Cynthia Lee has identified several troubling aspects of the gay panic defense. She wrote that the strategy reinforces negative stereotypes about gay men by portraying them as aggressive sexual predators. It also, quote, seeks to capitalize on unconscious bias in favor of heterosexuality. It would be hard to imagine a gay man successfully defending himself for the murder of a woman by claiming he was afraid for his safety after she asked him out. Yet this same idea has repeatedly been used to justify or minimize the murders of queer men. To establish that Jon was particularly vulnerable to temporary insanity, the defense brought in psychologists to discuss his mental state during the attack. Experts told the jury Jon had previously been diagnosed with manic depression. About a year before the shooting, he attended several counseling sessions with psychiatrist Dr. Habib Vasiri. Dr. Vasiri stated Jon suffered from depression, had issues with drug dependency, and endured a traumatic, abusive childhood. He testified that he even asked Jon to be hospitalized for some time. But Jon only attended 6 appointments with Dr. Vasiri before he stopped showing up. Though Jon was on antipsychotic medication for a short period, he didn't agree to be hospitalized, and he wasn't taking any medication when he killed Scott. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Carol Lieberman, told the media she believed Jon's appearance on Jenny Jones worsened his existing issues with his body image and alcohol. She said the show had, quote, caused him to begin a descent into madness and self-destruction until he exploded. He did not want to be alive when the show aired. Jon himself told his psychiatrist he had attempted suicide before. His father confirmed it, and the depression wasn't his only medical issue. He'd also been diagnosed with Graves' disease, an immune disorder that can affect a patient's mood. According to the Mayo Clinic, Graves' disease can cause fatigue, anxiety, and irritability. Jon's attorneys argued this toxic combination of psychological issues caused him to irrationally erupt in anger after Scott's TV confession. It may have seemed like a long shot, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. As the trial proceeded, the defense was gutsy enough to try and portray Jon as the victim. Coming up, the jury reaches a verdict, but the case is far from closed. On October 14, 1996, 25-year-old Jonathan Schmitz went to trial for the murder of Scott Amedure. Jon's lawyers deployed the gay panic defense to argue he wasn't in a stable state of mind during the attack. They pointed to a series of existing mental health conditions to claim Jon was temporarily insane when he committed the murder. But that was only the beginning. The defense also speculated that when Jon shot Scott twice with the shotgun, he thought he was acting in self-defense. To demonstrate this, they relied on testimony from Scott's roommate, Gary Brady, who witnessed the shooting firsthand. Gary testified that when Jon came up the driveway, brandishing a shotgun, Scott retreated inside their trailer. He tried to close the door, but Jon forced his way inside. Then Scott backed up and grabbed the closest thing he could, a wicker chair, to defend himself. According to Gary, the move appeared to be intended as self-defense. Scott held the chair like a shield. But the defense theorized that Jon saw this as an act of aggression. They claimed Jon was only carrying the gun and not pointing it at Scott up until that point. When Scott grabbed the chair, Jon thought Scott was going to attack him and reacted instinctively by firing the shotgun. In short, they claimed Jon was the one defending himself, not Scott. It was far from an airtight argument and not a version Gary agreed with, but it didn't need to be perfect. It was simply intended to introduce some measure of doubt about what happened that day. The prosecution's response to the gay panic defense was largely dismissive. It was clear that Jon was depressed and had a strained relationship with his homophobic, abusive father. But in their view, that didn't excuse the killing. As the attorneys pointed out, a lot of people suffer from depression, and a lot of people receive unsolicited sexual advances. The vast majority of those don't go on to murder their friends as revenge. It was also important to emphasize that the murder happened 3 full days after the Jenny Jones taping. Some found it difficult to believe Jon didn't plan the attack. While he didn't purchase the shotgun until the day of the crime, the 3-day lag made it hard to argue he'd reacted only in the heat of the moment. Following the closing arguments, the jury deliberated for a few days. There was no question that Jon would be found guilty of something, but the possible sentences varied widely. First-degree murder carried a mandatory life sentence, but Jon could have been convicted of second-degree murder, or even possibly of death resulting from discharging a weapon within city limits. The last charge was a misdemeanor and only carried a sentence of 2 years in prison. In the end, the jury convicted Jonathan Schmitz of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. The deciding factor for the jury appeared to be Jon himself. His clean-cut, non-threatening appearance won them over. One of the jurors later told Larry King that she wouldn't mind having a son like Jon. A murderer. According to Scott's brother Frank, the conviction didn't please either the Amadors or the Schmitzes. Though they disagreed about the extent, both families pinned at least some of the blame for the murder on the Jenny Jones show. The Amador saw it as a catalyst, and the Schmitzes saw it as the entire cause of Jon's mental breakdown. After the criminal trial, neither family felt as if justice had been served. That was a popular opinion, especially on the airwaves. Since there was no real debate that Jonathan Schmitz had killed Scott Amedure, reporters shifted the focus to the Jenny Jones show early on. It was a compelling argument, full of drama to infuriate and captivate their viewers. The public fiercely debated whether the producers of the show bore any part of the blame. Had daytime talk shows gone too far? In Frank Amador's opinion, at least, the Jenny Jones show was absolutely culpable. First and foremost, he blamed Jon for the shooting, but he also believed the show was deliberately designed to manipulate, humiliate, and shame its participants for entertainment. Frank felt it was utterly irresponsible for the program to lie to Jon about his secret admirer, only to pull the rug out from under him on air. The exploitation didn't stop with the Jenny Jones show either. Warner Brothers, the same company that distributed the show, also owned Court TV. That meant the same organization directly profited from the coverage of the tragedy after the fact, too. Hours of airtime were devoted to examining and re-examining the role of Jenny Jones in the murder on multiple networks. The coverage reached a fever pitch after the Amador family announced they were filing a civil suit against the Jenny Jones show. Daytime TV was going to court. The suit was a wrongful death action that claimed Scott's murder was a direct result of his appearance on the Jenny Jones show with Jon. The Amador family argued the show had ambushed Jon on air, intentionally withheld information about his secret admirer beforehand, and failed to properly vet him as a guest. Though the Schmitzes supported the attempts to hold Jenny Jones accountable, Jon wasn't included in the civil proceedings as part of a previous agreement. But even without Jon's participation, the Amador's claims seemed difficult to argue with. The producers had repeatedly told Jon his secret crush was either a man or a woman, but they knew it wasn't a woman. And Jon repeatedly informed them he wasn't interested in being on the show at all if his admirer was a man. Whether or not they had malicious intent, no one on the show's staff seemed to care if Jon was embarrassed. But the most important accusations from the Amador family were more controversial. Their suit also claimed the Jenny Jones show should have known an episode about same-sex crushes would lead to violence. Essentially, they said the show willfully put Scott in unreasonable danger. These claims were more contentious, but there is a strong connection between shameful emotions and murder. In fact, according to Dr. James Gilligan, humiliation is the most powerful psychological stimulus for violence. Even more often than frustration or rage, shame can lead to aggression. And the Jenny Jones show created an environment that cultivated and intensified those feelings, all for TV ratings. The focus on ratings and therefore profit was a key point for the prosecuting attorney, Geoffrey Fieger. He, along with Frank Amador, saw the Jenny Jones show as a money-making machine that left mountains of collateral damage in its wake. They felt the program intentionally harmed its guests to get a reaction out of them. Frank described it as, quote, experimenting on people for ratings. Those kinds of bold claims kept the story of the talk show murderer in the headlines for years. The civil suit didn't make it to trial until March 31, 1999. But 4 years after the shooting, the public interest in the case was still rabid. And in a trial about the role of the media in crime, prosecuting attorney Geoffrey Fieger knew he should keep the press talking. Fieger made the rounds on any show or news network that would have him, fiercely attacking the Jenny Jones show and every program like it. He called them trash TV and ambush television. He painted them as only concerned with profit, not people. To Fieger, there was nothing lower than a person who knowingly exploited others just for a laugh and some cash. But he still had to convince a jury, which meant he had to put Jones and other producers in the hot seat. When it came time for the show's staff to finally take the stand, they didn't come off very well. That was largely due to Fieger's combative questioning style. His cross-examinations were aggressive, but they accomplished the goal of putting his targets on the defensive. And often, that's enough. In 2011, lawyer Kenneth Nolan wrote an article about the essentials of cross-examination for the magazine Litigation. Nolan stressed that attorneys should have a clear goal when questioning witnesses. They shouldn't be asking questions they don't already know the answer to, and they should always be prepared for their responses. Fieger worked using exactly this strategy. He started by needling the staff about what they looked for in a prospective guest. He wasn't shy about showing open contempt for the staff. He even accused one producer of making up everything he said on the stand. He wanted to get a negative reaction out of them and put them off balance. After all, in his opinion, that was exactly what Jones and the producers did to their guests. He argued the entire premise of the show was to embarrass, hurt, and exploit people for entertainment. And Fieger made sure that point stayed on the jury's mind. In his opinion, it perfectly explained the scandalous topics Jenny Jones centered its episodes around. Besides the secret crushes divulged during the Scott Amador taping, Jones also frequently encouraged her audience to mock her guests and put them down. In one episode, spectators lined up to insult a woman's weight while she sat on stage in a revealing outfit. Those insults even made it on Jones's Best of the Year program. A similar dynamic was at the center of the show's regular makeover segments. People who dressed in punk, goth, or biker clothing were invited on the show just to be publicly ridiculed. Once the audience had their fill of making fun of the people on stage, The guests were cleaned up and brought out in more conventional outfits. While occasionally the show captured positive or uplifting reactions, all too often they devolved into petty squabbles and vicious mockery. It was easy to come to the conclusion that the segments were designed that way. The show manufactured drama, and the more over the top, the better. While it may have simply been for entertainment, real people got hurt. However, the producers of the show disagreed. They adamantly denied the accusations. They didn't feel they lied to Jonathan Schmitz about his secret crush. According to them, it was just supposed to be a lighthearted surprise, not a malicious deception. But the harder Feiger pushed, the more tense the atmosphere grew. At one point, Feiger asked a producer if the show had taught them how people reacted to embarrassment. The producer answered no, claiming the show didn't hurt, embarrass, or humiliate people at all. It came off as a brazen overstatement, considering they were on trial for an episode that led to a man's murder. It seemed naive to argue the show had never crossed any lines. With the groundwork established, the prosecution moved on to Jon Schmitz and Scott Amadore's taping. In particular, Feiger focused on the moment toward the beginning of the segment, when Scott was prodded until he described his sexual fantasies about Jon. Feiger's point was that those kinds of questions had no intent but to humiliate. It was hard to believe that leading anyone in that kind of lurid direction could end any way other than awkward embarrassment. Yet again, the producers denied that was their intention, but floundered when pressed. One of them, Karen Campbell, first claimed she only asked potential guests about their sexual fantasies if the guest brought them up first. She later walked the statement back, clarifying that she often did ask about their fantasies completely unprompted. How could she not? That kind of thing was prime daytime material. Feiger was clearly out to make the show's staff look untrustworthy, and for many, he succeeded. Though plenty of people still believe the show shouldn't be held accountable for the murder, no one could deny things looked bad on the stand. But the lowest point for the Jenny Jones show was yet to come, when they heard from the host herself. Coming up, the producers fumble and Jenny Jones takes the stand. Now, back to the story. On April 1st, 1999, the Amador family sued the Jenny Jones show, along with its distributor, Warner Brothers. In the civil suit, the family argued the show had put Scott Amedure in danger by intentionally humiliating his killer, Jonathan Schmitz, on air. For their part, the defense attempted to demonstrate that the taping had not led directly to Scott Amadore's death, and in the middle of the trial, new accounts emerged to bolster their argument. Two of the producers, Karen Campbell and Rob Muccianti, claimed Scott Amador had called the Jenny Jones show on the morning after the taping. Rob stated that Scott told him he and Jon hooked up the previous night as a result of the TV confession. Allegedly, Scott and Jon had slow danced and kissed. Karen didn't claim to have heard the story directly from Scott, but did testify Rob told her about the call right after he hung up. It was a jaw-dropping claim that contradicted so much of what people thought they knew about the murder. While there had always been rumors Scott and Jon were romantically involved, no one had ever heard it directly from either party, and the people closest to both men had always denied they were anything more than friends. But what was most shocking was the timing. It had been 4 years since the shooting. Jon's criminal trial was long over, and despite all the press coverage and police questioning, this anecdote had never before seen the light of day. Attorney Jeffrey Feiger didn't try to hide his surprise. He pressed Karen on why she'd never revealed the story to authorities or anyone else. Jenny Jones had even written a book on her experience during the criminal trial, but she never mentioned any post-show conversations with Scott. Karen's explanation was simple. No one had ever asked her directly if Scott had contacted the show following the taping. She stuck to the story despite the prosecution's repeated attempts to press her for more information. Feiger felt if her story was true, she or Rob should have volunteered the information to police to assist with their investigation. However, Karen and Rob insisted under oath that the call did take place. It's impossible to know whether that's true, but there's no record or evidence aside from the witness statements. So far, it seemed like Feiger and the Amadors had some momentum behind them, but their biggest battle was yet to come. At long last, Jenny Jones was called to testify. The proceedings had been a media circus from the start, but nothing turned up the drama more than the appearance of Jones herself on April 5th. Nearly 500,000 viewers tuned in to watch on court TV. Jones began her testimony with an upbeat confidence. She insisted that her role in the show wasn't to think about ratings. She wasn't out to use people. And she didn't think the idea of asking about a guest's sexual fantasies was too embarrassing or over the line. People always had the right not to answer her questions or to refuse to come on the show altogether. On her first day of testimony, she didn't seem to crack under the cross-examination the way some of the other witnesses had. In fact, many people came away with a positive impression of Jones. Her experience as a comedian and comfort in the spotlight allowed her to parry Feiger's pointed questions. Her lighthearted attitude didn't win over everyone, but for many, it was a breath of fresh air. However, her second day on the stand didn't go as smoothly. Feiger started with a gotcha question, asking Jones if she knew she was smiling while on the stand. She had to admit that she wasn't comfortable, but sometimes she grinned anyway. Feiger compared it to the way Jonathan Schmitz had smiled on her show. In legal terms, the quip wasn't exactly proof, but it did undermine an important component of the defense's argument. Over and over, the show staff insisted no one could have known Jon was uncomfortable at the taping. They pointed to his smile and friendly attitude on stage as evidence. However, just because Jon smiled for the camera didn't mean he was happy. Most people are familiar with the concept of nervous laughter, and psychologically, this same concept applies to all positive expressions of emotion. Smiling can actually relieve anxiety, and researchers believe these types of unconventional emotional responses can help regulate stress. Pointing out Jenny Jones's nervous smile on the stand finally succeeded in putting her on the defensive. After a few more minutes of questioning from Feiger, she sounded just as suspicious as her producers. So, he pushed her harder. He capitalized on the way she typically downplayed her own role in the case. Jones had a tendency to push responsibility onto others or the show itself. At some points, it almost sounded as though Jenny Jones had no control or input in her own show. Whether or not that was true, to the average person, it seemed unbelievable. Feiger also got her to admit that the program didn't bother to get permission from its guests to air their sexual fantasies. Jones tried to argue back, but sounded as though she was on shaky ground. It was a tense final act for the proceedings. Following Jenny's testimony, the lawyers gave their closing arguments. The Amadors and Feiger appealed to the jury's emotions. They asked them to punish the rich Hollywood machine they believed had exploited Scott Amedure. The show's attorneys, meanwhile, largely stuck to technical definitions. In their eyes, it was an open and shut case. It didn't meet the standard for legal negligence. There was no reliable way the producers could have anticipated the violence, and it wasn't illegal to ask Jonathan Schmitz to appear on the show. They argued they couldn't possibly have predicted what would happen next. As the civil trial came to an end in May 1999, no one knew quite what to expect. Most legal experts believed Warner Brothers would come out on top. They had a legal army behind them, and awarding a judgment in the case could potentially have massive ripple effects. If the Amador succeeded, the entire daytime TV industry might be in danger. On the other hand, there were points when the defense struggled to get the better of Viger. Throughout the proceedings, there was a distinct feeling that something was off. Everyone seemed to be performing in some way, so it came down to whose performances you believed. And in the end, that was what mattered. The jury found in favor of the Amadors, awarding them over $29 million. It was a tremendous shock and an unlikely victory for the Amadors. News pundits and TV hosts everywhere reeled. People speculated that so-called trash TV would be gone for good, soon. Others worried the implications would affect journalistic sources and a wide range of media fields would be caught in the crossfire. The television world seemed to be on the precipice of a major upset. But the mood didn't last. The Amador family never saw a dime of that money. Warner Brothers appealed the case and successfully got the judgment overturned 3 years later. The Michigan Court of Appeals disagreed that the show had a responsibility for its guests after the fact. The court wrote, quote, "Defendants in this case had no duty to anticipate and prevent the act of murder committed by Schmitz 3 days after leaving defendant's studio and hundreds of miles away." Warner Brothers called the judgment an important victory. The result was no doubt disappointing for the Amador family, but they'd always known they were fighting an uphill battle. To them, the point of the civil trial was to get their message out there and send a message to the networks. People's lives aren't just fodder for entertainment and should be treated with respect. Ultimately, the controversy didn't get rid of exploitative daytime talk shows. Jenny Jones ran until 2003. Similar shows like Jerry Springer stuck around even longer. Springer was on the air until 2018. Yet in time, the fad ran its course. Nowadays, daytime TV is a more varied environment, and there is far less ambush television. In a way, the format has become an outdated relic, symbolic of the 90s, and while Jenny Jones remained popular for years, she has since retreated from public life. Her once recognizable name has faded to obscurity. Jonathan Schmitz has also retreated from the spotlight. Since his trial, he's made few public statements. In 2017, he was released from prison at the age of 47 for good behavior. He served just 21 years. After the announcement, Frank Amador told news outlets he was uncomfortable with Jon's release. It marked one of the few times he'd spoken to the media in decades. At a certain point, he and his family had soured on the publicity. Back in 1995, they thought they could help Scott by getting his story out there. They hoped that they could overcome the public's misconception and use the media to their advantage. Now, they have a different view.